Welcome, everybody. Thank you to the team at Haus der Kunst for inviting me to moderate this panel conversation about the work of Rebecca Horn as understood through the concept of hybrid beings on cyborgs and body concepts. And I'm really just introducing and moderating the panel, but I'll just say a few things by way of introduction, and then I will introduce my co-panelists to you. And I believe that Haus der Kunst is going to show my PowerPoint. Is that correct? Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So about a year ago, I was contacted by Jana Baumann to ask me to provide one of the catalog essays for this very, very important show. And I actually didn't know a lot about Rebecca Horn's work. I mean, I knew some of the really well-known signature pieces, but I was so excited to explore the material in the archive. And I was particularly drawn to the early pieces where she locates herself as a kind of cyborgian figure as an artist. And then the catalog essay continues to think through what happens when she actually removes the body from the center of the machine and leaves us with just the machine. So if we have the first slide, this piece, of course, is a very, very iconic piece by Rebecca Horn. And I paid a little bit of attention in my essay to the meaning of the kiss when it separates from the human body altogether. And this is the kiss of the rhinoceros. And this is one of the pieces that comes a little bit later when the actual human body is no longer in the mix. And what we end up with is the electric charge of the kiss minus the bodies through whom the charge flows. But there's also a preoccupation in Rebecca Horn's work with the horn that's referenced in her name, with the horn that is the signature feature of the rhinoceros, with the singular horn that is the marker of the unicorn. And I thought about the horn in her work as less of a phallic symbol simply, and more of as one of these sort of countersexual prosthetic devices of the kind that Paul Preciado has written about so eloquently. So the next slide, please. This is one of those early works where, and sorry, I don't have my notes right here about the dates. I think this is a 1970s piece where Rebecca Horn, inhabits these masks and these prosthetic devices that allow her to draw. And the drawing is, at least in the pencil mask piece, is disassociated from the hand. And I think that severing of the relationship between the hand and the brush, or the hand and the pencil, is very significant here. The next piece. Okay, next slide, please. Yeah. So one of the frameworks that I gave for Rebecca Horn's work was remembering that particularly in the 1980s, really on account of a brilliant landmark essay by Donna Haraway, a lot of people were thinking about automation, the female body, the female cyborg, and so on. And there's a very long tradition of the female automated being, stretching back to the 1930s, to Metropolis, and stretching forward to Ava in WALL-E, who is, of course, a reference back to Metropolis. But also in the 1980s, when Rebecca Horn was very active, there was Blade Runner, which was extremely preoccupied with the relationship between the female body and the cyborg entity. And all of this material sort of finds its way into Rebecca Horn's work. The really disappointing feature of many of these male fantasies of the cyborgian female body is that almost to a text, they all imagine the automated female body as a site for either sexual slavery or reproduction. So Ava, the little iPod creature in the Pixar film WALL-E, her main role in the film is to generate new life by being an incubator for a little bit of green material that's left on Earth. And similarly, even in a movie that I think is quite good, Alex Garland's Ex Machina, the genius who has come up with a way to create lively robots does so only to create a fleet of sexual slaves for himself. So one of the things that Rebecca Horn's work does is sever the connection between the male fantasy of the automated female body as sex slave and automation for other purposes. And very often automation in her work is to scramble the cultural references that we have for automation. It's often useless. It does not have use value at all. Her automated objects are often rendered useless by their automation. So we go to the next slide is the Donna Haraway quote. If you put, yeah, I would rather be a cyborg than a goddess. That's just the reference point for the essay that I was pointing to. And then the next slide is, oh no, oh, okay. So, okay, I'll go with the order of my slides, is a reminder of these performance pieces in the 60s and 70s that put the female body in the center of the piece and exposed her to a certain kind of danger. And I think quite a few of Rebecca Horn's works similarly expose the female body to danger. In Marina Abramowitz's Rhythm Zero, she invited an anonymous public to make use of various implements on her body. And in Cut Piece by Yoko Ono, of course, people were invited up onto the stage to cut off her clothes. Rebecca Horn sort of doesn't involve the audience in quite that way, but does give us a sense of the jeopardy of the female body in relationship to both machine life and performance. Next slide. And here's one of these great cyborgian pieces. These are the flipped upside down typewriters. Remember when typewriters were a thing, when we still use them? Here they are rendered useless so that there's a sort of liberating implication that the women who have been forced to sit at these keyboards are also hanging out elsewhere. And this upside downness, I think, is a nice reference to a kind of revolutionary spin that Horn's work is often creating in the rendering of the machine as a useless ornament. And the next slide is probably where I'm going to end. This is a perfect example of another piece that revels in upside downness, the turning of machines and instruments around. But in this piece, which is the concept for anarchy, when the piano is suspended upside down and automated so that the keys fall in and out, it makes a really different music. And that music that she's calling anarchistic is music that we can hear buzzing all the way through her work, including in The Kiss of the Rhinoceros with its buzzing, humming, electrical music, including the typewriters, including the piece that was installed at Harvard where paint was sprayed across certain books. There's a kind of audio quality to this work that suggests that the revolution will not be televised, but if we listen closely, we might hear it. So I'm going to end there because I'm going to recede into my role as moderator and give the floor to my co-panelists, and just end by saying I'm really sorry that I couldn't be there in that amazing space with you with the last few days of the show. I'm joined on this panel today about hybrid bodies by Amanda Cachia, and I'm not sure the order in which people will speak, so I'll just introduce everyone and then move myself out of the screen. Amanda Cachia is a curator, consultant, writer, and art historian who specializes in disability art activism across intersectional axes of difference, including gender, race, and sexuality. She's the tenure-track assistant professor and assistant director of the Master of Arts in Arts Leadership graduate program at the Kathrine McGovern College of the Arts at the University of Houston, where she serves as the coordinator of the graduate certificate in museum and gallery. And Amanda and I are both online, so that's Amanda. With you in the auditorium today are Charlotte Matter and Sarah Sigmund. Charlotte Matter teaches and researches at the Department of Art History at the University of Zurich, where she coordinates the specialized MA program in art history in a global context. Her doctoral thesis explored plastic as a material in the arts of the 60s and 70s from a feminist perspective. And her current research topics include the question of class in art since the 80s and queer feminist separatist art spaces. She's co-founder of two initiatives dedicated to an inclusive art history. The first one is the Collective for Anti-Racist Art History and the research group Rethinking Art History Through Disability. She's been co-editor of the Sculpture Journal since 2023. Our last panelist is, at least in this order, is Sarah Sigmund, an art historian and curator. She works as a research associate at the Research Center for Technoaesthetics, founded in 2024 at the Academy of Fine Arts in Munich. Her research focuses on relations between art and science, materiality and production of artistic works, as well as their connections to post-colonial, queer feminist, and post-human topics. She's currently completing a doctorate on the topic of hybridizations, transformations of the human in art from 1920s to the present. She also realized the exhibition, Targeted Interventions, as part of a special exhibition on violence and gender at the Military History Museum of the German Armed Forces in Dresden in 2018. So I'll pass the floor to the first speaker. Thank you.
Well, I'm happy to go first because we might as well go in the order that Jack presented us. Hello, everybody. Like Jack, I'm sorry I couldn't be there with you in person, but I'm delighted to be invited to be on this fantastic forum. And I also want to thank Jana Baumann and Haus der Kunst for the very kind invitation. I have a short paper that I'll be reading for you. Like all of us, Rebecca Horn experienced disability, illness, and infirmity, but it was her early experience in the studio in the 1960s where she became sick due to the exposure of harsh chemicals and toxins in her art materials, which is most frequently chronicled in her biography. At that time, whilst only in her 20s, Horn developed a lung infection and had to be hospitalized for a period. She recovered in a sanatorium in Barcelona over the course of a year, and it was this time in convalescence which would prove to be greatly impactful to the development of her creative ideas. Inspired by the hospital environment in which she was immersed, she drew sketches of body extensions inspired by medical equipment to explore both the limitations and possibilities for the body and how the body retains malleable qualities in which to shift and transform into new shape and form based on the physical and social conditions in which it finds itself, either imposed or by choice. This qualification between imposition and choice is important to dwell on, because I argue that Horn's work was a direct response to the agency she was undoubtedly seeking over her own body in a time when she was feeling vulnerable, weak, immobile, without ability to feel and to sense, as she likely once did. And perhaps she even felt threatened or frightened. Next slide, please. By imagining and then actualizing her wondrous prosthetic creations, Horn was able to devise and redefine the world of the medical industrial complex into a more habitable and hospitable space that would feed her intellectual and creative inquiries for years to come. Her prostheses could move and feel and sense the world in ways that indicated perhaps an overcompensation for the lack of her ability to do those things in the stages of her illness, where they gave her superpowers and a heightened experience of the world at a time when she felt disempowered. Her prosthetic extensions were sensual, giving the artist access to explore desire and sexuality through tactile sensation, which is typically denied or repressed when one is weak or ill. Her prosthetic extensions were strange, even antagonistic, giving her control over an environment that was strange to her. And her prosthetic extensions were mysterious, allowing her to remain elusive, undefinable, and powerful, like a stranger in the night. I insist that all these qualities captured within Horn's astounding objects firmly extends to the language of radical infirmity and the generative power that this wields within the scholarly framework of disability studies. Disability and design scholar Sarah Hendren wrote a small text for Art in America in 2022 entitled Impairment as Impetus to elucidate how Horn's work subscribes to Hendren's title. But despite Hendren's astute observations, and even though we understand that Horn's experiences with illness and disability intuitively and profoundly shaped her approach to her art making and to the objects she produced, there is actually very little scholarship on how her work is connected to disability studies. As a disabled art historian and curator, I've long been interested in digging more deeply into Horn's oeuvre, precisely to assign new language to Horn's work that resonates with disability studies scholarship. To my mind, Horn's lived experiences of disabilities always already indicate a relationship to the discipline of disability studies, which emphasizes the importance of chronicling the lived experience of disability in scholarship to aid in our understanding of the ever-increasing nuance and complexity of disabled embodiment. Like Horn's prostheses themselves, the human body is equally precarious and intricate, and disability studies wants to not only explicate these narratives, but push them forward as legitimate discourse as the Academy itself comes to learn disability as an insightful pedagogy and methodology. Next slide. So while Horn's praxis is aligned with the important work of female artist peers of her generation from the 1970s, and those include the likes of Senga Nangundi, Carolee Schneemann, Marina Abramovic, Valley Export, Lygia Clark, Hannah Wilkie, Anne Hamilton, Nikki DeSaval, amongst many others, they're all equally consumed by experimentation with the corpus across various sociocultural and racial contexts. Horn's work was also offering something else, which has not been emphasized or articulated in ways that I find satisfactory and nor illuminating. Next slide. So what isn't discussed is how Horn's work is also very much intertwined with the work of disabled artists and the disability art movement in general, where Horn unequivocally finds compatibility with artists from the 1980s and 1990s, such as Bob Flanagan, Felix Gonzalez Torres, Joe Spence, who used their ailing health as a palette for their art, including cystic fibrosis, AIDS, and breast cancer in that order. Next slide. But even more profoundly, however, I argue that Horn has provided an important template and choreography for bodily experimentation as it engages with infirmity for our current generation of disabled artists, including Carmen Papalia, Panteha Abarishi, and Shawanda Corbett. Like Horn, each of these artists have devised idiosyncratic prostheses ranging from the comical to the formal, the antagonistic to the performative, as a vehicle to explore spatial and psychosocial identity as it rubs up against metaphoric and literal limbs, wounds, and scars. Next slide. In Carmen Papalia's long cane performance, he extends his white cane to become an agential force that claims his spatial environment and reclaims his identity as a blind person. Next slide. In Panteha Abarishi's BDSM performances, she uses bandages and a walker to explore sexual restraint and expression inspired by medical equipment she sees during her frequent hospital stays. Next slide. And similar to how the mechanic qualities of Horn's work has often been associated with feminist cyborg scholarship, Through Halberstam's and others' recent writings, Joanna Corbett uses the cyborg as a convenient metaphor and a character to inhabit to both escape and empower their bodies from the ableist realities of everyday life. Here, Corbett performs with an implied white mask in the tradition of gospel mime face painting, silent movies, and circus performances, which channel a cyborgian otherworldly modality that allows her to be in control and to be accepted. In the innumerable ways in which Horn's work ducks and weaves across humor, antagonism, superscript narrative, sexuality, and pathos, she also shares much in common with these disabled artists' contemporaries. Next slide. In Horn's vast practice, I also recognize that her methodology and approach is in fruitful dialogue with a neologism that I've recently coined, and which is also the title for my forthcoming second book, Hospital Aesthetics, Disability, Medicine, Activism. In the book, I argue that contemporary disabled artists are offering a new hospital aesthetics, which takes health and care into their own hands and body-minds. Hospital aesthetics is defined as artwork that explores the ever-subjective experience of being sick and ill, set apart from and outside of the clinical and therapeutic setting, and it's in opposition to the medical model of disability. Hospital aesthetics operates from a place of empowerment and agency, and Horn's work certainly falls within this realm. Across the chapters of the book, I identify how disabled artists are expressing hospital aesthetics through charting immunocompromised bodies, disabling medical assistive devices, including prostheses, and eschewing a radical sensorial approach to hospital aesthetics by unapologetically demanding desire and a fulfilling sex life, despite being deemed asexual by society at large. So Horn could easily appear across all of these chapters in my book, and yet while she's certainly not manifest directly in the writing, her presence and her artistic legacy is most certainly felt as a profound forebearer of sick body discourse. And my wish is that this continues to be centered and acknowledged in art historical and visual culture writing, in curatorial and museum studies, in disability studies, and in many other related fields. So like Horn's cock feathers, fans, and arm, leg, shoulder, and head extensions, her artistic and epistemological reach is more capacious and commodious than we had previously given it credit for. Thank you very much.
All right. So I began to think about the work of Rebecca Horn in relation with research for my PhD, sorry, my hair, which explored the use of plastics in art of the 1960s and 70s from a feminist perspective. My final chapter engaged with the toxicity of these materials and how numerous artists fell ill from working with them. And I was struck by the sheer number of artists who experienced health issues due to plastics, how their illnesses reflected the consequences of petrocapitalism and the industry's conscious withholding of critical information about these substances' toxicity. For, as the sculptor Robert Mallory noted in a report on his poisoning from his exposure to plastics, all of us tend to assume that if a material is really dangerous, it will not be found on the market. Unfortunately, such is not always the case. Indeed, the so-called toxic surprises from the plastics industry, described in 1974 in a 1974 Science News report, should not have come as a surprise. Already in the 1950s, internal investigations strongly suggested the toxicity of plastics, yet the results were ignored and subsequent studies kept secret within the industry. What also struck me was the lack of infrastructural care within the art world and art schools more specifically. Given that Mallory published his findings in Art News already in 1963, documenting not only his own intoxication, but that of numerous other peers as well. And that a number of reports on the health hazards of art materials were published in the following years. Yet these reports apparently did not get through to art schools or were simply not taken seriously, for no measures were taken in the 1960s and 1970s to educate art students on safety hazards or provide them with adequate protection. Rebecca Horn, as is well known, suffered from severe lung poisoning caused by the toxic fumes she inhaled while working unprotected with polyester resins and fiberglass as an art student at Hamburg's Academy of Fine Arts. As Horn later recalled, around 1967, I began to make large sculptures using polyester and fiberglass without using a mask because nobody told us it was poisonous. Aggravating an acute tuberculosis that Horn had contracted 2 years earlier, the lung poisoning compelled her to a long hospitalization, followed by a year-long stay in a sanatorium, after which she had to isolate to protect herself from infections. Upon her return to the Art Academy, Horn abandoned plastics and started, in her own words, to make light, movable forms around the human body using cotton, bandages, and feathers. Never again, as she emphasized herself, would she work with polyester, and she didn't keep any of these early works. Yet the rupture between Horn's use and abandonment of plastics is less definite as she claimed, I would suggest. Much like the exhibition here at Haus der Kunst, compellingly invites us to acknowledge continuous threads throughout Horn's practice, rather than dividing it into distinct phases. It is possible to understand her early experiments with polyester and fiberglass, which were casts of individual parts of the body, in relation to her subsequent body extensions. In fact, I even wonder whether we might consider plastics and their toxic chemicals as yet another agent in the human and more than human assemblages that Horn imagined. Plastic is intricately entwined with what environmental historian Michelle Murphy calls chemical regimes of living, speaking to the ways that our worlds and bodies are increasingly saturated with new molecules manufactured through chemical processes. After her lung poisoning, Rebecca Horn decisively shifted from plastics to materials that carried very different connotations. Materials such as feathers found in nature, related to care. But I would like to suggest thinking about plastics and more generally about the materiality of Horn's works beyond the binary thinking of synthetic versus organic or inanimate versus live matter. Plastics, for example, are quintessentially synthetic, but they are also deeply of the earth, most of them being dependent on oil, coal, or natural gas. Feminist cultural theorist Heather Davis prompts us to think about plastics and the new organisms that have appeared as a result of their proliferation, such as bacteria and fungi that feed off plastics, in terms of queer kin in her brilliant Plastic Matter. Considering, along with Davis, how plastics articulate queer futurities by transforming our bodies does not mean to condone the violence of the plastic industry, but rather to think about and with toxicity as a part of our lives, beyond normative notions of what counts as healthy or not, human or not, desirable or not. This aligns with the way that Mel Chen, whose scholarship explores the intersections of queer and gender theory, animal studies, disability theory, and critical race theory, thinks about toxicity as a way to acknowledge and value mutation, sickness, and transformations of the body. Chen invites us to reconsider how, quote, the toxin, as much as it may have been categorized as inanimate, is more than mere matter, for it has a potency that can directly implicate the vulnerability of a living body, end of quote. Plastics became an intimate part of Rebecca Horn's body through intoxication. They caused a chronic illness that arguably informed much of her subsequent engagement with the notions of care, the body, mobility, and interdependence, as in such works as Head Extension, which may be understood in terms of control, discipline, and power relations, but also in terms of mutual care and reliability. Toxicity, following Chen, becomes a framework to understand how embodiment is always multiply composed and to defy the fantasy of containment. This is a way to understand the body as porous and malleable, not as sealed off from the outside, which I want to suggest also speaks to Horn's explorations of hybrid bodies, interdependence, and animality.
Thank you, Charlotte. Yeah, I will continue directly. Many thanks to Jack for the introduction, also to Jana for inviting me to this panel, and for the opportunity to share my thoughts on hybridizations in the work of Rebecca Horn. In my presentation, I would like to describe Rebecca Horn's work as manifestations of a post-human thinking. In doing so, I will focus on the fact that her work thematizes the becoming of bodies as machines, animals, and molecules up to their liquidation. In the following 10 minutes, I will draw a line from her works in which the human body still appears within hybrid constellations to those in which it is absent and dissolves. I argue that Horn's works trace the dissolution of the human body not as a passive disappearance, but as an active hybridization with machines and non-human entities, reflecting the shift towards a post-human condition. Dissolving. Rebecca Horn began in her earliest works using film techniques to explore the dissolution of the body, covering it in black paint and making it disappear in front of the camera's eye. But unlike the work of the artist Hito Steyer 40 years later, who in the face of surveillance and omnipresent camera eyes, as well as the image processing of the digital age, asked how the human body can become invisible to these technologies in order to resist systems of biopolitics, Horn's performance seems like a playful mimicry between body, color, and the background. She seems to still use the camera as an accomplice, as a friendly technology in front of which she tests the transformation and dissolution of the body. In the same year, Horn developed the portable sculpture Überströmer. Inner bodily processes are transferred into a sculpture by means of tubes that pump red liquid over the performer's body. However, this piece has no anatomical claim, nor does it, like other works from the 1970s that work with blood or the performative opening of the body, evoke shock, sensation, or disgust, as Gina Payne's performance Azione Sentimentale might have done. Also, the blood substitute used in Horn's work does not have gender connotations, as in Judy Chicago's from the same time developed work Red Flag. Horn's Überströmer takes a different approach from other feminist or even essentialist works by female artists of the time. The Überströmer is a translation of the blood circulation of every being into a mechanical system in which the connection to the human body still exists, but the apparatus can continue to work without it. The standardized body disappears and it is replaced by mechanical devices or prostheses. The Überströmer makes it clear that the choreography of human bodies, as Jana has excellently highlighted in the exhibition by emphasizing the relations to dance, is transferred to non-human beings as well as things and materials. We can observe this interest from the Überströmer to the work Hauchkörper. The minimalist appearance of the 2017 work does not initially suggest a connection to bodily systems, but the brass rods seem to move in rhythm with the respiration as if they were reeds set in motion by a breath of wind. As the human body disappears, like sadly that of the artist herself, life continues in her works with the repetitive vitality of the objects. Expanding. On the way to this choreography of things, Rebecca Horn developed numerous works that deal with different forms of hybridization. The human-animal relationship is the starting point, I would say, which is explored through various works. While Rotbrust merely evokes the aesthetic quality of birds with red plumage on their breasts, in the work Blinzeln, an animal-human relationship is established between the bird and horn that evokes methods of imitation as well as direct empathy with the animal without the film showing any actual interaction between the two. It is striking that bird and horn figures repeatedly appear as beings between the human and non-human world. In this context, I would like to propose the assumption that in the work of Rebecca Horn, becoming animal is always also becoming machine. In contrast to other contemporary positions, such as Anna Mendieta, all bodies seem to be techno-bodies already, as in the theory of posthumanism as expounded by Donna Haraway or Rosi Braidotti, the nature-culture continuum is evident in the works, producing hybrid bodies that are neither natural nor artificial. Even a supposedly biological becoming, as here as becoming bird-like, is caused by techno-aesthetic machines. Horn's extensions expand the relationship between body and space, often creating distances and new forms of contact. They have an effect on the body like a ballerina's shoe, shaping it, making certain movements possible and others impossible. For example, gripping with the fingers of a glove or seeing and being touched in the case of Paradieswitwe or Hahnenmaske. In this way, her prostheses contradict the idea of an optimizing human enhancement. They produce new physical patterns of action and movement and are the opposite of a standardized body and are conditioned by their extensions. Or as Rebecca Horn herself best described it for Hahnenmaske, the intimate space, and I'm quoting her, the intimate space between us is filled with tactile tension. My sight is obstructed by the feathers. I can only see the face of the other when I turn my head looking with one eye like a bird. The extensions expand the body in its dimensions, but limit its usual range of functions. For example, the head extension requires the help of others for the wearer to be able to move around. The physical extension of the horn transforms the singular human being here into a social animal that depends on the care of others. Liquidizing. In the works I just mentioned, distances to the environment are often created, thereby generating a different body-space structure. In the later works, such as Paradiso, the performing body is also replaced by the viewer within expansive installations. Here, the physical relationship is created by the breast-shaped and milk-donating funnels. In 1993, Horn's work nourished the exhibition architecture of the Guggenheim Museum in New York. You can read this as a feminist gesture, being one of the first female artists to have a solo exhibition there. The breastfeeding of this heteronormative place through somatic substances can be read as a subtle institutional critique. The human body has been liquidated here into a somatic substance that resembles bodily configurations. This also demonstrates Rebecca Horn's, I would say, posthuman understanding of the building as a living entity, as mentioned by Nancy Spector in the interview in the catalogue. Liquid substances appear repeatedly in Horn's work, especially in the 1990s. This is also the case in the work Hydra Piano. Mercury, a reflective silvery material, is located in an elongated box and is occasionally pushed by a motor that makes it move like a snake through the box. In the words of the philosopher and physicist Karen Barrett, this reveals the material's own agency. However, the pushing also makes it clear that at the same time agency is also partly produced, not only as a work of art, but also through the mining and processing of the material mercury in this case. These production processes were already alluded to by Alexander Calder's Mercury fountain shown in the Spanish pavilion at the 1937 World's Fair, which alluded to the cinnabar mines of Almadén in southwestern Spain. As a valuable raw material, the mines were fought over during the Spanish Civil War, and while still in the hands of the Spanish Republic, financed the war against the fascist forces under General Franco. The mining had previously financed Spain's colonial aspirations and contributed to the industrialization, while the workers were exposed to the harsh working conditions in the mines and the toxic poisons of the material. Taken from the earth, the material is integrated into what Bruno Latour would call an actor network. This also extends to its use as a material in art and to the subject that come into contact with it along the way. Rebecca Horn repeatedly uses materials that have been produced through extractivism. This is also the case in the work Hybrid, for example, where two funnel-shaped vessels are filled with sulfur and coal. Here, too, the material seems to refer to an eternal flow of extractions and shifts, like the hybridization of geological layers, ecological systems, and the feedback of toxic materials on bodies. Horn shows this massive hybridization of the Earth as part of the cycle of life. All the toxic material that humans have transported with machines affects not only the human body, but also the non-human bodies of animals, plants, and microorganisms. These toxic cycles are what she experienced in her own body as early as the 1960s. All living entities are in contact to these hybridizations that are produced, for example, here in the coal mine of Lützerath or at the sulfur mine at the Ichen volcano on Java. This whole system, in my opinion, becomes visible, and I will come to the end, in the work of Broken Landscape. It is demonstrating that we live in a nature culture. The landscape is modeled, and all the actors in it continue to breathe in a also polluted air. This understanding of the actual presence that the works produce is what Donna Haraway calls the Chitolocene, which, like Rebecca Horn's body of work, brings various forms of hybridization to light and asks questions about the responsibilities for them. To summarize, first, Rebecca Horn dissolved the normalized human body. It is the carrier of her extensions. Then it becomes an absent part of her techno-aesthetic machines. In the end, she liquefies the body and shows the agency of things and materials. Horn's work compels us to consider the post-human condition, one in which the boundaries between human, machine, and material have dissolved. But as her own experience with toxic substances suggests, this future also carries heavy responsibilities, urging us to rethink our relationship to the non-human world we shape and inhabit. Thanks for your attention.
All right, thank you to everyone who has presented. That was a beautiful set of presentations. There are lots of topics for us to discuss. I was just looking at a quote that came to mind after listening just now to Sarah and to her meditations on this piece on the broken landscape. And Rebecca Horn said in a series of interviews that she did in 1993, she said, my machines are not washing machines or cars. They have a human quality and they must change. They get nervous and must stop sometimes. If a machine stops, it doesn't mean it's broken. It's just tired. The tired or melancholic aspect of machines is very important to me. I don't want them to run forever. It's part of their life that they must stop and faint. And I think, we could usefully discuss brokenness a little bit. Many of the machines in her archive are either broken or breaking, and through their brokenness, they serve other functions. And I gave the typewriter and the piano as an example. So I think we could, that's one thematic would be brokenness, pick up on the brokenness of the landscape and the brokenness of these machines that she imagines as having a kind of humanity to them. And we could question what Rebecca Horn means by the human. What is she looking for in the machine that she catches a glimpse of in terms of the human? What's the human? Both Amanda and Charlotte have asked us to pay attention to the question of disability in relationship to Rebecca Horn's work. And I really was interested in Amanda's suggestion that we think in terms of hospital aesthetics. And I guess I'd like to hear more about hospital aesthetics and the opposition that maybe we can find in Rebecca Horn's works to this medical model of disability. I'd love us to talk more about animality. I was thinking about not just the animal as an animal, but the animal as a kinetic being that does things differently than the human. So, for example, there's a lot of repetitive motion in Rebecca Horn's machines that mimic animals. A lot of pecking, flapping, almost a different set of semiotic expressions, or expressions that are speaking in a different mode of semiosis: scraping, fluttering, flapping, scratching. In what way has Rebecca Horn possibly lifted a system of communication from animals rather than just the full body of the animal? And maybe the question of violence in Rebecca Horn's work. There's violence that's done to the body, and somebody, I think it was Sarah, was talking about the ballerina's shoe as an example of how the human body has to be, shoehorned into the structures that hold it. What about violence in Rebecca Horn's work? So violence, animality, not as a whole entity, but as a series of actions and activities. Something more about this opposition that we might find in her work to the medical model of disability, and perhaps a sort of early take on a feminist ecological critique through the interactions with toxic chemicals in the work. If anyone wants to pick up on any of that, those were some of the currents that I saw running through the presentations.
Who wants to start? Amanda, maybe, no?
Sure, I'm happy to start. I was thinking a lot about, yes, there's a strong opposition to the medical model of disability that I'm arguing is taking place in Horn's work, and, this affinity with hospital aesthetics, which is, this concept that I've developed for my new book. But I also am curious to kind of put out there for all of you to think about how there's also a lot of contradictions, I think, in what is happening in Horn's work, and also in some of even the disabled artists' work that I've mentioned, and namely that I use the term supercrip, and I also, we're talking about cyborg aesthetics, and that's kind of one of the main themes for this panel, is that despite those terms, giving Horn and her disabled contemporaries like this kind of agency and empowerment, there's also like this contradiction in that the supercrip has, in today's world, been scorned by disability community. It's a term that we, kind of deny because we don't want to be known as super or as superpower. We just want to be sort of, for want of a better word, and this is a dangerous word in disability studies, but we just want to be normal, right? We want to be normalized. And then also the cyborg has kind of this more contradictory relationship and this idea of, and I really liked what, Jack was talking about in terms of the body, having this kind of, the prostheses having this kind of humanity, and that there's this emotional connection with the machine that Horn has. But in fact, the disabled body is in danger of, it casts disability into this kind of otherworldly mode. And it kind of also reinforces these poor stereotypes that the disabled body has, where we might be seen as, well, we have a prosthetic leg, we're seen as competent, but yet we're also seen as threatening and as violent, which Jack used that word violence as well. So I guess I want to just try and problematize my own paper that I offered, and to say that it's not really as straightforward as that, and that even sort of this opposition to the medical model of disability, there's still people who would argue, well, surely the disabled body benefits from the medical industry in some way. But I would argue that it's far more nuanced than that. And there's, shades of gray. And of course, I kind of picked that apart in my writing, but wanted to hear what my fellow panelists had to say about all of that too. Thanks very much.
Yeah, thank you, Amanda. If I may pick up on that, because I also do see a lot of contradiction, which I was a little bit unsure how to address. So I'm happy that you're addressing them. I'm thinking specifically also about the figure of the blind person in Horn's work, which is something that I'm still trying to figure out how to think about that. Specifically also because there's these different ways throughout her work of thinking about visual access and non-visuality, which is something that is experienced well in the work that I was showing before in the head extension as something that becomes a possibility of belonging, of experiencing modes of relating to the world that are different, of haptic ways and sensual ways of relating. But then there's also this figure of the blind dancer in the movie that is deeply unsettling also, who's learning to dance, who is invoking all these stereotypes of the glasses. It's a sighted actor who is taking this part. So it's also a kind of there's different ways of her thinking about vision, and then also this way of thinking of human and more than human ways of seeing, as in the work you were discussing. Also, this way of looking of birds, way of seeing the world. So yeah, I think it's good to also be addressing some of the contradictions that are in the work. Yes.
Yeah, what I found also very interesting now from your questions, Jack, is the question of brokenness and violence, because I read it like this, that in her work, it seems like it's part of life, like the body gets shaped through, like, for example, the shoe, and but also is violent to other systems and don't know, is extracting materials from the earth. And I read it like this, that it's like part of the cycle of life in her understanding. And yeah, there are so many aspects that we can discuss, like how did she understood like really the human-animal relationship? Is it about mimicry, or is it about imitation, or is there actually a difference? Is she trying to get in the position of the animal? Is would, like in the case with the kakadu, where's the kakadu actually coming from? All these animals she's also using in her artworks, like the feathers, for example. It's a question, this is not just feathers from pigs, it's like very special feathers. So do they have a connotation? These are very, yeah, for me, interesting questions I can't answer, but maybe someone is also in the room who can answer this, who worked with her in person. But yeah, this is research that needs to be done, I think.
Okay. I'll just say a little something about violence in the work, because I think, you know, there's a tendency to see feminist work as being reparative in some way, and that's partly why I wanted to show the Marina Abramovich and the Yoko Ono, to remind us that in fact, very often feminist art work and performance from this period was situating itself in relationship to the very explicit violence of the culture. And I was thinking about the very late work of Rebecca Horn, the Flying Books Under Black Rain painting that was installed at the Harvard Art Museum. And it is a combination of a kind of a commentary on both the human and the machinic, but one in which the machinic becomes a vehicle for the destruction of a kind of pantheon of great writers. And I'm sure it may not have been exactly intended this way, but there were books open books installed on the wall of the gallery, and the books were Fernando Pessoa's The Book of Disquiet, Franz Kafka's America, and James Joyce's Ulysses. And these are works that are both preoccupied with the self, the city, journeys that people go on. But also in these books, the self is a sort of missing entity, or is coming undone, or is coming apart. And so when she set up this machine to basically spray paint on the books, I thought it was both a collaboration with the narratives of those books, but also a kind of a way of like writing graffiti on this canon of works, the works that are actually these works seen as both great and the alternative to the canon. And she's just spraying black paint on them, literally redacting the books, rewriting them, scrawling upon them via this machinic entity. So this is no one who's doing this thing, but this thing is being done. And you know, that's part of the violence that I see in the work. There's a kind of yes, there's an engagement with animality and looking for the human and the animal, but there's also an attempt to harness a particular kind of violence and use the machine to enact acts of breaking as well as acts of resonance. So I'm conscious of the time here, and it's hard to, you know, gauge an audience. I don't see the audience at all. So I presume there is one, and that they're somewhat engaged, given that the presentations were pretty great. So you know, maybe Sarah or somebody who's in the room can have a look around, see if anyone's got there. Sarah or Charlotte, maybe you can see if there's anybody who wants to ask a question.
Yeah, so we have a microphone here. And already a question.
Thank you very much. I'm happy to start. And these wonderful presentations already made a lot of thoughts in my mind. I have really a lot of questions, but I'm going to limit to two. And one is for you, Charlotte, because thank you for Sarah to bring up the mercury works, because mercury evaporates in room temperature and the vapors are highly toxic as well. So this would be my first question, what you think about these works. And the second question is a bit more complex, because I discovered in the archival material that one of her main inspirations for the Eintänzer in New York was her observation how the rhythm of movement in New York of the people in the street is very different. How they walk to get to the subway, how there's a different speed and rhythm of movement just with everyone in the public space, and that yeah, how you also as someone coming there, you are really immediately kind of drawn into this rhythm and adapt this rhythm. And so I was thinking about how, like, if you think of the body and the machine relationship, if maybe it could be also interesting to look at the notion of the body as the machine as it is theorized by Silvia Federici, instead of only looking at the cyborg and Donna Haraway. So yeah, this would be my second question.
Thank you so much. So maybe I'll start with your first question. Well, I was really happy that you brought the image of the Hydra piano, because I thought, okay, I want to keep it short. But Mel Chen has an excellent chapter actually in the book that I was quoting from. They have two chapters on the toxicity specifically of metals, and there's one on lead and one on mercury. And so it's really a work where and also there's the fact, so for those of us who have seen it, it really moves along. So there's this really plasticity almost of the work when it's moving. So I really see some connection between these, the toxicity of plastics, the toxicity of mercury. It's like in this glass casing that is almost like Schneewittchensarg, you know, and there's really this proximity to death, but also this constant rethinking of precisely the boundaries or the porosity of life and death. What I was trying to articulate, this yes, this this moving beyond boundaries in her practice and thinking. And also the fact that it's relating to the question of the snake. So Hydra, the multi-headed serpent, and the snake that keeps on recurring throughout her work. And the snake is obviously also this typical figure of the pharmacon, which can be both poison and a remedy. So there's always this ambiguity in her thinking with toxicity, I think, which is really, really, really very interesting. Yes. And I'll pass on for the second question to whoever.
Yeah, I think Silvia Federici is talking about how capitalism produced the female body, and yeah, I think this is also a very good hint and needs to be done, and would be important for our discussion. Yeah, I still need to think about it, I think. Maybe the other two have something to add.
I didn't get what the reference to Federici's, what concept from Federici?
The notion of thinking beyond the notion of the cyborg and rethinking it really in terms of capitalist extraction, how feminist artists have thought about that.
Okay. I think it's a great invitation. Maybe we should hold on to
Yes.
that.
A final question.
I wonder if you guys could talk a little bit about, so, when you're experiencing the mechanical works in person, there's this sort of seamlessness to it, right? The way they operate autonomously, but they were fabricated, right? It takes labor to install them. It takes human bodies to put them, there's a kind of erasure of that I think maybe lets us talk freely as if they were divorced from the human body a little bit, some of them, when they don't actually picture a human body, but the like very nature of bringing them into a space sort of hides how much they depend on the labor of people knowledgeable about their mechanical parts and their when they break down, etc. And I just wonder if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, this is maybe I could answer this question. This is also what I try to refer to the materiality of the works, because they don't exist without any connections to the work that is done to take them out of the earth. And also, of course, they are produced as artworks, and also other people are involved in this process and also are involved in this kind of actor network that is actually developing through the development of the artworks themselves. So this is quite an important topic, and it's also interesting how maybe there are people who know insights into the working process in the studio of Rebecca Horn. That would be very interesting to hear more about it, how they actually worked with materials like mercury, for example.
I mean, one thing to say as well is that all artworks in all museums are, established as if no human labor went into hanging them, framing them, measuring their distance from the floor and the ceiling, or whatever it may be. And I think Rebecca Horn's work is not necessarily that different, except in the fact that there is sometimes there's a toxic materiality to the piece that could endanger the worker. I think that question is actually more about the museum. That we definitely should investigate how Rebecca Horn's machines were made. Did she make them? Did somebody else make them? Did she send a blueprint somewhere? But so many works that are not necessarily machinic, like paintings, are now made by assistants and groups of paid people in factory-like settings. That becomes a question for the museum, the way the museum hides the labor by simply putting things in empty space as if they just appeared there miraculously. That might be a question for Haus der Kunst and any other places where, like the Harvard Museum, where this other piece that I was talking about appeared.
Thank you so much, Jack, Charlotte, Sarah, and Amanda for all your contributions. So we're having a break now, and we would be happy to see you again in 15 minutes for the third panel. Thank you so much.